Hi, and welcome to the Anti-Waffle podcast of Em and Pixie. Woohoo! And together we'll try to talk about the research about any gobbledygook. Each episode we'll be talking to a researcher who will discuss the work they're doing, looking at why this research is important, and asking how did they get into this field. We hope that it will be informative and interesting and bring a bit of the academic world into the real world. Today we have Professor Chloe Marshall, who is Professor of Psychology, Language and Education at UCL's Institute of Education. Thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you, it's lovely to meet you both.
Thank you. Do you want to start by telling us about your research?
I can, yes. So I'm interested in language and literacy, and I'm particularly interested in how children learn language and how they learn to read and write. And within that, I'm interested in those children who have challenges in learning to read and write and learning to speak. So most children learn their first language without any difficulty, without any conscious effort, without thinking about it. Mm-hmm. And most children, after a few years of schooling, will pick up reading and writing and become quite confident readers and writers. And there are some children who have more difficulty with those things than would be expected. So, for example, children who have what's called developmental language disorder, children with dyslexia, children with autism, maybe children who have other languages at home and for whom English is an additional language, might need a little bit of time to catch up. Children living in poverty who might not have as rich language input, might have difficulties at school. So those are the children that I'm interested in. I'm interested in children who are acquiring language and literacy in challenging circumstances.
Right.
And so that's the name of the lab that I run, Acquiring Language and Literacy in Challenging Circumstances.
Brilliant. So do you actually go out to schools? How do you find your subjects?
Participants. That's a very good question. I mean, I don't go into schools much now myself, but my students do. So I work with students who are teachers, who are speech and language therapists, who are parents, and so we recruit through schools, through speech and language therapy services, and through social media. Parents find out about our research and want to take part.
Excellent. Cool.
And how do people identify that their children aren't hitting the right milestones?
That's a really good question. I mean, one of the first really important milestones is around the child's first birthday. So that's when children tend to produce their first word. So whether they're speakers and producing their first word or signers and signing their first sign, tends to happen around their first birthday. But there are some children who might not hit that milestone until they're around 2 years of age. And that's obviously quite a delay. So that delay in that first milestone is quite a big sort of red flag that something is sort of going awry with language development.
Trigger.
Yeah, absolutely.
To say start testing or looking.
Exactly. And it's difficult because there's so much variation in children's language development. So I don't know if you're mothers yourselves and you've had children, but you will know that they, not always easily comparable with other children. Most children will be starting to put words together into short sentences, sort of 2-word sentences, by around 18-24 months of age. And again, if children are delayed in that, that's often an indication that they might be late talkers. Yeah. But some children who are late talkers will catch up later on. It's really difficult to identify who are those ones who are going to really need a lot of support and those who aren't going to need so much support. I tend not to work so much with younger children. I tend to work more with school-age children. Mm-hmm. So the children I work with, if they have a language disorder or a literacy disorder, tend to have already been identified by teachers, by clinicians, by psychologists. So I'm not involved in that early identification, and I'm not a clinician myself, so I wouldn't do that diagnosis.
Because it's funny, because my daughter, she's 19 now, but she started talking late.
Okay.
But I think it was because she, because we had her tested for autism and stuff, but I think it was because she was just so keen to start speaking that she just made up her own language, and she just started going thinking that she was talking, but no one could understand her, of course. So,
but she probably had wonderful intonation patterns. She obviously sounded like she was talking.
Yes, and so it's and she's demonstrated the same sort of behaviour in her cooking. So like I taught her, as soon as she learnt how to make pasta, sort of like when she was like 7 or 8, it's like, oh, well, I don't need to learn anything else because I know how to cook, and so I will make everything else up as I go along. So I think that's just her nature.
Just her personality, her way of approaching the world.
Yeah, so
well, I'm sure it's done her,
I can do this.
I'm sure it's done her very well.
Yes, because she hasn't stopped talking since.
So you work with the clinicians and practitioners that deal with these children, and your research is looking into how to advise them, how to...
I'm less on the practical side, so my research is more trying to understand what it is that children find difficult about language and literacy and why it is that they might be having difficulties. Okay. So what the sort of underlying cognitive mechanisms that support language and literacy learning, why those might be not working as well in certain children. In terms of the translational research, that's obviously what we all aim for. We want our research to be useful in practice. But that requires a lot of teamwork with clinicians and teachers to do that. And a lot of my research is more on the sort of theoretical, the experimental side, trying to understand how children learn and how their learning might be affected.
Right. Okay, that's really really cool. So has anyone... So once you've done all the research and you've got all the information together, although I can't see when you'd get to an end of it.
No, exactly. This is always an ongoing research programme, that's right. We tend to find during research, we find out more things that we didn't realise that we didn't know, and therefore that leads to the next research project. So it's never finished, that's right.
So do you think that it would be something that you and your department would sort of like come up with a theory or a new process of how to do things, or would that be that someone else, you would just send the research out there, send out your baby into the world, and then people then take it up and make up their own
it's
sort
probably,
of like
It's probably
systems.
easier to illustrate through an example. So with colleagues at UCL and at City University, we've been researching deaf children, so children who are deaf and hard of hearing, and we've been looking at the relationship between their language skills, and we have deaf signers in the group who are using BSL, we have oral deaf children in the group using English. We're interested in their language, and we're also interested in what are called executive functions. And executive functions are all the things that you need in order to plan, to make decisions, to achieve a goal, to remember what you're doing, to pay attention to what you're doing, to inhibit any distractions while you're doing your task. And we know that executive functions are really, really important for academic work. So children with stronger executive functions tend to do better academically, and they also tend to do better with sort of language, literacy, mathematics, other academic subjects. Yeah. So executive functions are really important. Language is obviously really important for children's success at school. We know that there's a relationship between executive functions and language. We know that deaf children tend to have delayed language acquisition because of their poor access to spoken language. Yeah. Even deaf children who are signing tend to have reduced access to British Sign Language because they will tend not to be born to parents who are using British Sign Language, so their access to BSL will tend to be delayed. So we know that deaf children tend to, not always, but tend to have delayed language acquisition, tend to also have poor executive functions, but we don't quite understand the relationship between the two. And we carried out a longitudinal project, so we followed children over time. We followed both deaf and hard of hearing children and also hearing children without any language or executive function difficulties. Mm-hmm. We followed them over time, and we were interested in this developmental relationship between these two things. Yeah. So is it your development of language that drives your development of executive functions? Or is it, as your executive functions get better, that helps you to learn language better, so you learn more language? Yeah. Or is it an interconnection between the two? And there are various different theoretical models out there as to which comes first and which is more important. And what we found in our research is it's really language which is taking the lead. It's language which is driving children's executive function development. And that's actually the case for deaf and hard of hearing children, as well as for typically developing children. We had quite a big sample. We had 6 to 11-year-olds, so primary school children. We followed them for a couple of years. Now that's the basic research, but to me it has a very obvious implication, and that's that language development is absolutely critical to children's not only later language development, but also these executive function skills that they need in order to do well in school.
Right.
So an obvious implication of that is that children who are at risk of not having rich early language exposure, children who are deaf and hard of hearing, we need to really focus on those early years and give them rich language exposure. We know that depriving children of language has really bad knock-on consequences. So we need to give children really rich language input from a very young age.
Right.
And for deaf and hard of hearing children, that could be through cochlear implants. And we know that cochlear implantation is happening younger and younger. But in addition to that, because cochlear implants are not a cure for hearing, they're not going to turn a deaf child into a hearing child. So we need to provide a visual language as well.
Right.
For example, British Sign Language for children who are growing up in the UK. So having access to that rich language from the start will help children not only to develop, obviously, language, but also executive function skills. So we've done the basic research, but we're talking to teachers and to clinicians and to parents to get that message across that early language is really, really important. Now, of course, how you offer that depends on the services that are available, on parental choice, on a whole set of issues which we don't have a huge amount of control over.
Yeah.
But we're trying to get that message out that early language is really, really important. And if you deprive a child of language, that's going to have serious knock-on consequences. So that's sort of how that relationship between research and how end users use the research, that's how it works. It's not as easy as me saying, this is exactly what you have to do, when you have to do it, why you have to do it.
Right.
I'm not a professional teacher.
Yeah.
I'm not a speech and language therapist.
Right.
But hopefully there's a clear message. Early language is really important.
Yeah.
So whatever you need to do, you need to make sure that children are
They have
having
it.
that really rich language input.
Yeah.
So that's a sort of example of how that interchange might work.
Wow.
Very interesting.
I always knew that language, making sure they were exposed to lots of different language and reading and things was important, but I hadn't realised that it was going to have such a knock-on effect, the other functions it was going to have.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, language, if you think about it, language is critical to so many things. You obviously can't read without language. You're going to make much better friendships, have much better social relationships if you have rich language. If you're going to develop emotional regulation, to be able to regulate your emotions, your moods, having a good language both externally to talk to people about that and get their support, but also regulate internally, language and thought are really, really important. So language is critical. And we know, for example, that amongst the prison population, there's a huge overrepresentation of people who have language and literacy difficulties.
Right.
So the knock-on consequences throughout life are really, really
Not
important.
being able to function in society.
Exactly,
Right.
exactly. To be a fully functioning member of society, it's a very
To
good
be able
thing
to
to have
communicate.
strong language
Yes.
skills to be able to communicate, absolutely. So my research is obviously only tackling a tiny part of that.
Yeah.
As you know, research, there's a limit to how much any one person and any one research group can do. So it's just a tiny piece of that puzzle contributing to this big message that language development is really important and we need to support it.
Right.
The message trying to get more sign language into schools at an early age, even for hearing children, so that they can have that exposure. I don't know whether deaf children would always go to a mainstream school.
Deaf children are more and more going to mainstream schools, and so very few deaf children are exposed to BSL.
Right. Classes, but
No, so a lot of schools are interested in programs. There are various programs which supplement speech through signs, so using signs when singing or when doing activities. And this comes from an idea that having signs in addition to speech can help children's spoken language develop and can also potentially help children's cognitive non-verbal development. And there's a whole big area of research and controversy over whether that's the case. I think it's a real tragedy, actually, that sign programs like that are available to hearing children, and yet there's very little support for the parents of deaf children who might want to learn BSL, who might want to send their child to a school where BSL is used and they have very little support in doing that. So there's a sort of interesting paradox there between where it comes to hearing children. People understand that yes, using sign is fun and it's great and it can really help them with their language development, whereas a lot of deaf children are deprived of that opportunity. And remember, a lot of deaf children, the cochlear implants will not restore normal hearing. These are children who will still have impoverished access to sound. And when I'm doing it now, when we speak, we move our hands around. We get really important information from the hands. Sign languages are obviously very different to co-speech gesture, but the point is that we are multimodal communicators. We use our whole body when we communicate. Anyway. So why would you deprive a deaf child of having access to a fully manual language when we know that this is how we communicate?
Right, no, I agree. I think it should be. I think all children should be taught it. I think just like how in secondary school we start teaching French and Spanish or German and whatever, then sign language should be part
absolutely.
of that.
And British Sign Language is not a foreign language. This is one of our national languages. Imagine how wonderful it would be if everybody could sign. I mean, my father, for example, is losing his hearing. If he knew BSL, this would not be a handicap for him.
No,
he would be signing.
And wherever we went,
everybody would understand.
No, that's a good idea.
So do you sort of collaborate wider across UCL?
I do, absolutely. So one of my main collaborations is with the Deafness, Cognition and Language Research Centre, who obviously have expertise in deafness and sign languages, and so I've learned a huge amount. I'm collaborating with colleagues there. Also collaborate with people within this department, Psychology and Human Development at the IUE. One of the wonderful things is supervising PhD students, because PhD students are always co-supervised, and so that gives the opportunity to set up new collaborations with people that you might not otherwise work with. So I have collaborations, sort of supervision collaborations with other people at the IUE, but also collaborators abroad. So I have a collaborator at the University of Thessaloniki in Greece. So she and I have supervised a wonderful PhD student together. I have a big collaborative project at the moment with colleagues in Sweden at Lund University. So that is one of the joys of the job is the collaboration and getting new ideas, because no one person can know everything, and the more that you learn, the more you realise you don't know, and you need to draw on the expertise of people who do know. So it works well.
Excellent.
How you got to your position? How's your story got to where you are?
A very roundabout route. This is not going to work over audio, but the gesture would sort of be like this, a sort of very winding hand gesture. My undergraduate degree was in biology, so I specialised in molecular biology and genetics. But I wasn't a particularly good practical researcher, a bit like your daughter with the cooking. I would sort of throw things into the pot, and apparently that's not what you're supposed to do. I had an undergraduate project where I was trying to isolate DNA, to do some DNA sequencing. And it took me 6 weeks just to isolate the DNA from my cells, because I was putting in the wrong amount of salt. I hadn't realised that you did actually have to follow the recipe very carefully. So I was always interested in theoretical issues to do with biology, but I just didn't want to do that as a job. I didn't want to do any practical biology. And I actually decided to train as a teacher. So I trained as a Montessori early years teacher, which I taught in nurseries for several years, and I trained Montessori teachers, and I really enjoyed that. Because I think it's because I was working with 2 to 5 year olds, and that's such a fascinating time for language development. Particularly in the Montessori curriculum, the materials for developing children's early literacy skills are really rich and really exciting. So I was taking in children to my nursery at the age of 2, and there's huge variability, as we've already said, around that age group, but some of them weren't speaking very much. Some were already little chatterboxes, but some weren't speaking very much. And yet by the age of 5, they were almost all going on then to big school with a huge amount to say and a huge amount of confidence in saying what they wanted to say, and well on the way to reading and writing. But there'd be the occasional child who just didn't follow that path. And sometimes it was for a very obvious reason. I taught children who had Down syndrome, who had autism, and autism can often affect language development. Or maybe these were children who just arrived from another country, and so they were learning English for the first time, and so of course their progress was a little bit slower initially. But there was the odd child, I just couldn't put my finger on it. I couldn't put my finger on why it was that they didn't seem to be making as much progress in language and early literacy. So I decided to go back to university and do a master's in linguistics in order to find out more about language. It was because I'd read a very well-known book by Steven Pinker called The Language Instinct. And that was the first time that I realised that you could be a scientist like I was, but study language. Because when I'd been at school, languages and sciences were completely separate. You either did sciences or you did languages at A-level. You weren't allowed to do both. I mean, I wanted to study Latin at A-level, but because I was going to do biology at university, I had to not do Latin and do maths in order to give me the science background and the maths background that I needed to study science. Couldn't do Latin and biology. I mean, what a weird combination. So I'd specialised in sciences. I was always fascinated by language, but I didn't realise that you could study language as a science. So I came to UCL to do linguistics, which I loved, with the plan to get back into the classroom and support my children better. I probably should have done speech and language therapy. That would have been a much more practical degree to do. Chomskyan, very sort of theoretical linguistic syntax wasn't maybe the best foundation for going back into the classroom. But I discovered that I loved linguistics. I loved studying language. And the second week that I was doing my master's degree, I went to a departmental seminar. And there was a very wonderful, inspiring woman called Heather Van der Lely who was giving a talk. And she was talking about teenagers with what in those days was called specific language impairment, what we would now call developmental language disorder. And even though I'd been a teacher of young children and she was talking about adolescents, I could see some of the features, some of the characteristics that she was talking about with her adolescents with language difficulties. I could already see the precursors to that and recognise that in those children that I hadn't been able to put my finger on what was wrong with them. And so I thought, ooh, that's really interesting. I want to find out more about that research. And quite without thinking, because this hadn't been my plan, I just went up to her at the end of her talk and said, I'd like to do a PhD with you. I just blurted this out. I hadn't intended to ever do a PhD. I couldn't afford to do a PhD. I needed to work. And for some reason, she didn't look at me like I was mad. And she said, well, come and meet with me. We'll have a meeting. And a couple of weeks later, there was another professor giving a departmental seminar, Professor John Harris, and he was talking about an aspect of language called phonology, which is all to do with the sound systems of language and the patterns for putting, the rules for putting sounds together. And I thought, ooh, I could look at what John's interested in, phonology, in these children that Heather's studying with specific language impairment. So that's what I'm going to do my PhD on. And when I met with Heather to discuss this, it turned out that she and John had wanted together and indeed had started doing some work together. And so they were very happy to have a PhD student who was going to do that line of research. So it was so serendipitous. If, maybe if I hadn't gone to that seminar, I wouldn't have carried on to do a PhD. There was just something so inspirational about what she was talking about that really struck a chord, both in terms of the sort of long-term practical outcomes of how to support these children better, which is how I was initially coming at it from my teacher perspective, but also theoretically sort of shedding light on the cognitive mechanisms that underlie language, how language is structured, why language is so important.
And if you know the system of it, then you can catch it earlier. Then you know what to, now this is what we need to be looking for, and we can look for it from when they're born. And if we're looking for it and making sure we establish it from when they're born, then we don't have the problem when they're in their adolescence, or at least we've spotted it and we can sort of temper it or whatever.
You're exactly right. The earlier that we can identify, or the more accurately we can identify a potential language learning difficulty, then potentially the earlier we could not necessarily intervene, but just put that support in place and guide parents. And so you're absolutely right. But we need to understand language in order to be able to do that, and we need to understand how children learn language.
Right, and what it is, that key factor that...
Exactly. So I was very fortunate that Heather agreed to take me on as a PhD student, and then I was fortunate to carry on and do a postdoctoral research program with her. And at the same time as I was working with Heather, I became interested in sign language. So I met a professor at City University called Gary Morgan. Similar thing, he was giving a talk at a conference, and at that stage he was talking about a couple of very young deaf children, and he was talking about phonology in their sign. I was at the conference talking about phonology in hearing adolescents who are speaking English. But the sort of things that I was talking about phonological complexity, about markedness, about errors, he was talking about with these young children in BSL. But I was thinking, gosh, does a sign language have a phonology? Because phonology you normally think of in relation to sound.
Yeah.
But when you think of a sign in British Sign Language, it has a hand shape, it has a movement that it makes, it has a location where the sign is created. So there are these little sort of building blocks of a sign in the same way that sounds are the building blocks of words. So you can think about those building blocks and think about the difficulties that children might have with those building blocks. And so I ran up to Gary at the end of his talk and I said, we need to work together. We need to look at specific language impairment, developmental language disorders in children who are sign. And I would predict that they would have difficulty with phonology, just like hearing children with language disorders do. So let's look at that. And I was very fortunate that this was at the time where the UCL Deafness, Cognition and Language Research Centre was being set up. And so there was funding. So as part of that big centre grant, we managed to look at developmental language disorder in deaf children who were using BSL, and we were able to identify language disorders in these children, which was really, really exciting, because before that, I mean, clinicians and teachers of the deaf always suspected that there were deaf children who were learning sign who had developmental difficulties acquiring sign, that their slow sign acquisition wasn't just as a result of poor input, of not seeing enough sign around them, of not having signing parents, for example, or signing teachers. But our research really showed that even when you compare children who've had the same amount of sign language input, there are some who are falling further behind than you would expect given their general level of intelligence, given how much sign input they've had. So we identified developmental language disorder in signers, just as we can identify developmental language disorder in hearing children. And that's really important for thinking then about the support the deaf children need with their sign language acquisition. That it might not just be a question of more input, but a question of input that's more carefully tailored to their learning needs.
Yeah. Just like any other children.
Absolutely. And that work was also very important theoretically, because there was, certainly when I was doing my PhD and postdoc, there was a very sort of influential school of thought that the difficulties that hearing children have learning language could be due to something about the way that sounds unfold over time. You get these really rapid transitions in speech between different sounds. And it might be the rapidity of those transitions which children with language disorders have got problems processing. And if they can't process those rapid transitions, that's going to have an impact on their language learning. And it's particularly going to affect the sort of things that children with language disorders find difficult. So, for example, those little endings at the ends of verbs, like jumped in the past tense, that at the end of jumped, which is really important grammatically for signalling that something happened in the past tense. If you've got problems sequencing or problems picking up on those very rapid transitions, you might not pay attention to that, you might not process it at the end of the word, and therefore you might not produce it or understand it. But sign is very different. I mean, the visual modality, things unfold a little bit more slowly. We don't have those rapid transitions in hand movements. And also there's a lot more simultaneous information. So when you produce a sign, there's much more simultaneity of information. The hand shape is being produced at the same time as it's moving. You can see the location. So things are sort of happening simultaneously to a greater degree than in speech. So if you can find developmental language disorder in signing children, that suggests that there is a cause beyond auditory processing and fast sequential processing, that there might be something more fundamental about language learning, which is going awry in these children, potentially something which is not linked to the modality, the spoken or the visual modality, but something which is much more about how language is organised. And that sort of links into the whole sort of nativist, generativist tradition of language rules and, sort of what we come endowed with as humans when we're born, the sort of mechanisms which help us to acquire language. So both theoretically and practically, that work was very interesting to be involved in.
If you had to sum up why your research is important, could you do that for us in a brief couple of sentences?
Well, it's important, as any good research should be, for both theoretical, interesting, intellectual reasons, as well as having an impact in the real world, and particularly an impact on children's lives.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you very much for your time.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for talking to us, and thank you to everybody for listening. We'll put all the links up on our website, which is the antiwafflepodcast.wordpress.com, and our Twitter account, which is @antiwafflepod. And please do get in touch, as we'd love to hear from you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.